Okay, welcome to your last test review podcast before Christmas break, your last unit test before your semester final. It's not going to be an easy test. This is an important unit and has a lot of vocabulary and information, so fasten your seatbelts and we'll get started. Now, one good piece of news is I think the dates in this unit are easier. Basically, the heart of the Romanesque period lies around 1100. The heart of the Gothic period around 1200, and the Proto-Renaissance in Italy is mostly the 14th century or the 1300s. I've included just a few more dates to help you out here. Okay, here is your first essay. You should recognize this artist, and there's a lot you can say about this painting and why it represents this artist's style. But the College Board, by the way, assumes that students would not know this work. They wanted them to be able to identify it as a representative work, identifiable by artist, but not necessarily knowing the particular subject. On the other hand, you who've benefited from Sister Wendy do know this particular subject, but again, what you're really going to be talking about is how this is representative of the particular artist, and yes, you do need to identify him by name. And here's your second essay, and this one's just 5 minutes. Again, the College Board does not expect you to recognize either building, and these images are not included in the Common Survey textbooks, to quote the College Board, including yours, and I did not cover them in my lectures, but just by looking at these photos, you should be able to identify the overall period. They're both from the same period. And you should explain what distinguishes the church on the left from the church on the right. Hint. Think geography, but you need to say more than just what country each comes from. Explain the differences in style between these two national forms of the Gothic, okay? So what kind of church structure is this? You saw this image in the lecture, and it shows up again on the test. Hint, the aisles and the naves are the same height, which eliminates elements such as the gallery. And this kind of church is found mostly in Germany. You often see it labeled with its German name, which, another hint, sounds a lot like its English name. Okay, this is one of those questions for which there are multiple image-based, one of the images for which there are multiple image-based multiple choice questions. Oh, got garbled there, didn't I? So who painted this work? And by the way, this comes without identification on the AP exam. But I'll give you a very broad hint. It's on the back of the Maesta. So, what is the work's approximate date? It's derivative of what earlier style? What city is this artist primarily associated with? What medium is used for this work? How is it painted? A feature of the work that derives from previous artistic practice includes the use of, we're looking for a material here, and to find the answer, check out the edges of Christ's robe. The term for this era of painting is, and a hint, the Academy gives this label to its lectures on this era. Okay, what's this? What is the half circle over the door called? Which period and style does this work belong to? By the way, this kind of sculpture really, some variation on this photo, this work shows up, as far as I can tell, on virtually every AP exam. So know it, know the period. Now, until this period, this kind of monumental stone sculpture hadn't been seen since when? What period did we last see monumental stone sculpture? There's one rather tough question about the sculpture above the door. I'm going to use the process of elimination to help you find the answer. Notice the Last Judgment theme. It was common in sculpture of this period, right? The spatial setting is symbolic rather than realistic, right? Particularly you see hierarchy of scale. The work doesn't really present a narrative. It's a moment in time, if you will. I mean, it tells a story, but it doesn't have a continuous narrative. You don't follow the story you would, for example, with a register. But the sculpture is all about blank, the remaining answer, which you probably would be able to guess anyway. Hint, consider what Christ is doing with his hands and some of the characteristic features of sculpture of this period and the one that follows. Okay, here's a definitional question. An altarpiece with two wings flanking it is called a, you've encountered this term before. Okay, you recognize this, right? And you all know who painted it, right? Where is it? What is it called? I apologize for that funny look and learn label. It's the best image I could find. This is another one of those image-based questions that has a whole series of questions associated with these two images. So both of these statues date from what art historical period? Both reflect what religious development in this period. And what we're looking for here is a special devotion to what religious figure, who is the central religious figure of art in this period. What kind of craftsman would probably have made the standing statue, that is the statue on the left? When I use right and left, I'm referring to what you see when you look at it, so don't get complicated and try to turn yourself around. The standing statue is the statue on the left. So, what kind of material is it made of? What kind of patronage probably accounts for the elegance of the standing statue? In other words, who would have commissioned it? What is the term for the seated statue? The term is also the title of the work, but it's a term you're going to need to know in the next unit as well. It's used for depictions of this particular religious scene. What medium is the seated statue, the statue on the right, made from? And look at the distortion and anguish in the seated sculpture. What is this intended to inspire? Why was this done? What's the purpose of this work? By the way, that's not going to be as hard as you might think to answer. I think you'll find the answer is pretty obvious. So I think that the image-based questions are among the tougher that you've seen. So you want to bone up on these figures in your book. In fact, whenever I say you've got a multiple question image, I recommend you take a look at it. Now, the image on the left showed up in a fairly recent AP test, and it's not in your book, so I was puzzled by this. The image on the right, by the way, is, and hint, they serve the same function. At any rate, when I couldn't find the image on the left, I checked the newest edition of your textbook. I actually received a copy of that when I took my AP teacher course this summer, and by golly, there it was. So I'm going to read the description from the latest AP textbook just in case this shows up again. Okay. Sorry, I need to maneuver here a little bit. The veneration of relics reached a high point in the 11th and 12th centuries, prompting the devout to undertake the often dangerous pilgrimages to hallowed shrines in Jerusalem, Rome, and throughout Western Europe, especially Santiago de Compostela. Churches vied with one another not only for the possession of relics, but also for the magnificence of the containers, that is, reliquaries, that preserved and protected them. The case of the relics of Saint Faith, or Santa Foy, F-O-Y in French, an early 4th century child martyr, that's the figure on the left, is a telling example. A monk from the Abbey Church at Conques stole the saint's skull from the nearby Abbey of Agen around 880. The monks justified this act as a furta sacra, a holy theft, claiming that Saint Faith herself wished to move. The reliquary they provided to house the saint's remains is one of the most sumptuous ever produced. It takes the form of an enthroned statuette of the martyr, fashioned of gold leaf and silver gilt over a wooden core. The reliquaries prominently features inset jewels and cameos of various dates, the accumulated donations of pilgrims and church patrons over the years. The saint's oversized head is a reworked ancient Roman parade helmet, a mask-like helmet worn by soldiers on special ceremonial occasions and not part of standard battle dress. The monks added a martyr's crown to the ancient helmet. The rear of the throne bears a crucifixion image engraved in rock crystal, establishing a parallel between Christ's martyrdom and Saint Foy's. That may be more than you really thought you needed to know about that image, but since it showed up on one AP test that I have, it could very easily show up on others. And since it's not in your book, I thought I'd share that with you. Okay, as always, I have some random questions which represent general multiple choice questions. So, which periods in this unit is associated with pilgrim churches? That shouldn't be hard. It's the name of the chapter. What facade decoration is especially characteristic of Romanesque churches? And I just talked about this. What form of art reappeared in this era? Who is the artist best known for painting in the Italo-Byzantine style? What's the other term for that style? By the way, that's another question that seems to show up in a lot of different exams. And a related question from a different test, as I just said. Many enthroned Madonnas painted around 1300 were painted in what style? These are all basically getting at the same answer. What architectural features tend to distinguish Gothic from Romanesque cathedrals? By the way, this question appears in multiple forms in different tests. Some variation of this is almost certain to be on your exam. So what were the great initiatives of Abbot Suger? What changed with Gothic cathedrals? I think you know that one. It's pretty basic, but be prepared to give to look at multiple versions of that question. Okay. What is a predella? And I have tried, perhaps with almost too much help, to outline it here in red. By the way, the question on the exam does not give you an image. This question appears in more than one test, and so you may see it more than once on your test. I can't actually remember at this point, but that's a term you absolutely need to know. It's an AP favorite. How did pilgrims get to the relics in the pilgrimage church? What this is really asking for is what is the part of the church that gave entryway to the apse chapels, or the chevettes, or apsidal chapels, they're called by different names, where the relics tended to be housed. And this photo should give you a clue because it's a picture of that feature of the church. Okay, this, no surprise, is one of those images for which you have multiple image-based questions. You need to know this work. Who is the painter? What is the painting technique? In other words, what medium did the painter use and on what did he paint? What is the approximate date of the painting? And by the way, they're not going to give you picky dates. Again, if you get those general century measures that I gave you at the beginning down, you'll do just fine on those questions. The painting, notice this question keeps coming up, shows the influence of what other style? Hint, check out the noses. What was the function of the work? In other words, it was part of an blank. The painting was made expressly for the cathedral in what city? And who are the figures in the foreground, the ones I've outlined for you in green? You can check that in your book. Okay, this particular question caught me a little by surprise. It's an early Romanesque lintel covering, and its style was derived from what earlier kind of work? I thought that was a tough question, so I'm going to give you a really broad hint. Remember Junius Bassus from the last unit? What kind of an artifact is this? And you've got your answer. Okay, what kinds of vaults are characteristic of French Gothic cathedrals? What vaults are characteristic of some English Gothic cathedrals? And by the way, you should know that Amiens and Rheims are high Gothic cathedrals. That's very important. Also, these cathedrals, in fact, I just gave you one of the answers. These cathedral styles are associated with an adjective that goes in front of the term Gothic. Okay, I've already told you. Rheims Cathedral is high Gothic. Notice the cross-rib vaulting, the verticality. Exeter and Gloucester Cathedral, on the other hand, are the blank Gothic. You need to know the answer to what goes in that blank for one of the questions on your test, and it will also help you. I recommend you use that term as well when you're writing your second short essay. Okay, once again, for this piece, I'm going to give you some of the answers. That's a reward for watching the podcast, but it also reflects the fact that your book only includes the two right images. But in fact, the later and interestingly earlier versions of the textbook include the entire figure. And also give this work somewhat more explanation. So I'm going to try to fill this in and give you a good fighting chance on your test. This will start easy. What art historical period do these sculptures date from? What are they decorating? In other words, where are they found? What is the subject of the two figures on the left? Remember, that's on the left. As you look at the painting, we're talking about one of those figures having wings. Well, talk about a hint. The two figures are the angel Gabriel and Mary, and from that you should be able to guess what's going on, but you need to know the term that shows up as a title of so many works. The two figures on the right, that's the other side, reflect the influence of what earlier sculptural style? Take a special look at the clothing. And then what contemporary style, that is style from the same period as the statues, influenced the two figures on the left? I'm actually going to give you the answer to that one, another podcast viewing reward. It's the French courtly style. Notice that it's medieval and not classical clothing that the figures are wearing. So what accounts for the difference in style between the two pairs of figures? And this is something that's talked about more in the earlier and later editions of the textbook. So let me explain. The statuary was sculpted over an extended period, now not over centuries, but maybe over a decade. And more significantly, it was sculpted by different workshops. So you probably had very different sculptors working in different workshops doing the two figures on the left and the two figures on the right, although those pairs are clearly interrelated and were almost certainly done by the same workshop. Finally, and this is in your book, how do these figures represent an important advance in sculpture that's characteristic of this period? I can see two obvious answers to that question, and one of them is going to be the correct answer on your AP exam. Okay, the College Board asks a question about the facade of Rheims Cathedral without including an image. I'm going to give you the image without the question. This is clearly an image you should carry around in your head because Rheims is just a very exemplary and famous high Gothic cathedral, as is Amiens, another one you should probably kind of have in your head, or at least you should know by its name that it's high Gothic. At any rate, what are the facade's most striking features, and to which Gothic period does this belong? I've now given you that answer a couple of times. Okay, sorry this is a little blurry. You saw this building on the video and on the slides of Sienna, and it's the building that houses the allegories of good and bad government. Remember Ambrogio Lorenzetti. So what period does this represent? By the way, one answer might be Proto-Renaissance, but it's not the only choice. It's not one of the choices. Another description is late blank. Remember that this is still the medieval era, as another hint. So what was this building's function? Why were the allegories of good and bad government there? And where is Sienna, anyway? I'm basically just looking for a country. That one shouldn't be difficult for you. Okay, I think this image and the questions associated with it are a little confusing because we actually talked about the cathedral that's in the right-hand part of this photo at the beginning of the unit because it dates from the 1100s. But you should be able to recognize the complex and its location right away. And hint, take a look at the campanile or bell tower. It has a very distinctive tilt. Hint, hint. So where is the complex located and what kind of a complex is it? In other words, what purpose do these buildings together serve? What style of architecture does the building at the back represent? Most of the complex represent. Again, pay attention to the dates I just gave you and take a look at where this appears in your textbook. But here's a trickier question, which wasn't really talked about in your book, and I don't think I talked about it in my lecture either. So I'm going to help you out. The round building in the foreground is the baptistry. And I know I did talk in an earlier lecture, I think actually from the early Christian art section, about how very important baptism was in Italian Christianity. This building dates from a later period. How can you tell? Well, this is another one where I'm going to help you with the answer. Look at the stone work on the facade. That's often referred to as tracery. And it takes the form of pointed gables. You saw those also in the Cathedral of Orvieto. So if you've taken the time to listen to this podcast, I've just given you still another answer. On to some more random questions. By the way, these questions do not have accompanying images. The place names, however, should for the most part be a giveaway. The Annunciation and the Visitation at Rheims Cathedral are examples of what? By the way, you just saw these works, these sculptures. The Mission of the Apostles at Vézelay is an example of what kind of work? Vézelay should be a giveaway, but you should know that particular work. When the College Board uses the title of a work without an image, that's saying you need to know this one. The rise of monumental stone sculpture in France and Spain in the 11th and 12th century is associated with the decoration of what kind of building? That is not a hard question. Why was Abbot Suger's church at Saint-Denis so important in art history? The east end of a medieval church housed the apse and the blank. And hint, it's where the monks sat. Remember that the priest faced the apse and the altar and therefore had his back to the congregation? Remember that the monks got to see the back of Duccio's masterpiece, the Maesta? That's because they were sitting in the... Oops, I thought I had another image there. At any rate, another random question, what is a crypt? And where does it usually sit in relationship to the nave? Where is it found? Oh, there, I skipped this. I must have stuck in an extra slide without realizing. But here is a diagram of a Gothic church. And notice you see the apse, and you see the apsidal chapels. And then you see the place that's part of the apse that we were looking for in the last question. Okay, I think I've given you enough information there. And here is still another diagram of naves, or actually a diagram and a picture. On the left is the elevation of a Gothic nave. You've seen variations on this drawing. This is actually a slightly different one. I like the way it was labeled. I hadn't found it when I made the podcast. So again, that's a Gothic church on the left, and you should notice its three parts. You see the arcade, you see the triforium, and you see the clerestory. On the right, you see a Romanesque nave, which more characteristically has two stories. Again, the nave arcade at the bottom. And up above is a gallery that people could actually walk through. This is something that essentially disappears in Gothic churches as you put in flying buttresses and stained glass windows and the clerestories get huge. Clerestories, by the way, appear in later Romanesque architecture such as Durham Cathedral. At any rate, that's a lot of terms that you need to know. There are many church architecture terms on the AP exams. Okay, the image of the interior of Saint-Denis is not on the exam, but it should give you a pretty broad hint if you don't already know the answer to the question of why Abbot Suger was so important. I actually probably should have put that next to the Abbot Suger question, shouldn't I? Okay, another question, and boy, I'm being generous here, is what were the main forms of Gothic two-dimensional art? The College Board does not give you the answer by showing you these images, but I'm feeling generous. Gothic cathedrals were not known for their mosaics, right? Byzantine churches were. Tempera panels and frescoes were much more important in Proto-Renaissance or 14th century Italian churches. Although we do have some Romanesque frescoes that have survived, especially in northern Spain in the Pyrenees. And we'll see a lot of etchings and woodcuts, but not until we get to the Northern Renaissance. Okay. Now we come to what I think is one of the tougher sets of questions. It's another one of those image-based pairs where you have multiple questions. The College Board does not identify this image, but I'm going to tell you what it is and be kind. It is the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, a very famous, actually not as, it's famous as a cathedral, but it's more famous as a destination. Many of the questions involving these images are tough, rather technical questions. I'm going to try to help. Pay attention and look things up that you don't know. What is the art historical period and approximate date of this church? By the way, I don't think that one's tough, but now it gets harder. What is the mathematical unit that organizes this plan? Now, I have tried to make this clear by outlining it in green. That green square is my addition to this cute little slide. The nave of the church is organized in three-dimensional modules that are based on this unit that I've outlined in green. What are those three-dimensional units called? This term is used repeatedly in your textbook. I used it in my podcast, and hint, it starts with the letter B. What architectural features articulate, that means define, these three-dimensional modules that start with a B? Well, you can see them pretty clearly here. Note the pillars, those massive pillars. Remember what those are called when you have kind of multiple column forms melded together? And what do you call those arches that span the nave? That one starts with a T. What kind of vault covers the nave of this church? It's characteristic of this period. Note again, this interior shows that two-story elevation I just talked about, similar to what we saw in that earlier slide. The bottom level, the one defined by the piers and the arches, is the nave arcade, and the level above it is called, I just gave you that answer. Another hint, people could walk around the nave at that second level. The smaller piers aren't merely decorative, so it's not a triforium. Sometimes there was a narrow passage to walk behind the triforium, but basically it was a shallow space. Churches of this style and era were designed to accommodate a specific kind of religious ritual. And I think you probably already know this, but another hint, it's the ritual that gave its name to this chapter. That one should be easy. And by the way, to give you further help on this question about the interior of Santiago de Compostela, here are two interior photos. You see the first level arcade and the second level above it, topped by that particular kind of vault. Okay, here's an image from the Bayeux Tapestry. And by the way, the image is not included in the AP exam. This is another break for you, but it should help you figure out the answers to some questions about this work. So what event is the tapestry describing? Is it an actual historic event? And by the way, this is another work that shows up all the time in the AP tests. It lends itself to an easy multiple choice question, an easily written, I should say, multiple choice question. What people were involved in this story being shown? How was the work made? In other words, what medium, what materials were used? Does it contain text? And you have the answer right there on the slide. And if so, in what language? I'll give you a hint. You see the word rex? That means king. In what language? Okay, we're almost done here. Okay, this is Simone Martini's Annunciation. This style of painting, developed by Simone Martini, favored brilliant color, lavish costumes, intricate ornamentation, and it was known as the blank style. And just as a hint, the answer to that question is on the original slide that came with this image. Believe it or not, we are on our last question here. Which painter is credited with being the first to master the illusion of showing modeled figures in a three-dimensional interior space? And by the way, this question does not come with an image. This is another Christmas gift from Mrs. McConnell. And this picture should indeed be a pretty broad hint. It's the presentation of Mary at the Temple from the Arena Chapel. We did not see this image in class, but I wanted to find one that showed an interior space. Okay, I have given you a great deal to absorb. I wish I could tell you that the course is going to get easier as we get into the real Renaissance after Christmas break, but I'm not going to lie. Not just before Christmas. Santa Claus might leave me a lump of coal. On the other hand, I think the art gets even more spectacular, even more fascinating. And the artists are quite a group of characters. So get ready, fasten your seatbelts, and study hard for this exam.